on the air with an inside look at how former President Trump tried to go to the Capitol on January 6th with explosive new testimony from ex-White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson. The shocking new information on who sought pardons and how Mr. Trump knew the crowd was armed, yet he pushed them to march on the Capitol anyway, and then tried to grab the steering wheel of the car he was in. Those details coming up. Plus, President Biden's HHS secretary laying out the new steps to preserve abortion access, where the procedure is now and where it's banned. But can these rules give even more lasting protections the Democrats want? And new protections could be coming soon against the ever-evolving coronavirus. What we're hearing today from the FDA about new vaccines to beat back Omicron. Plus, convicted sex trafficker Deshaun Maxwell sentenced to 20 years in prison. What we're learning today from the inside of the courtroom at the hearing for the former confidant to Jeffrey Epstein. And a judge weighs whether the misconduct allegations against Cleveland Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson are in violation of the NFL's personal conduct policy. What that means for a potential suspension. We'll have that later in the show. Hey there, I'm Tom Costello filling in for Hallie. And did you see it? Bombshell testimony today from the first White House staffer to publicly testify in front of the January 6th committee, Cassidy Hutchinson. A former aide to then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows was in the West Wing on January 6th and with former President Trump during his speech on the ellipse that day. We're going to go through the biggest things we learned from her testimony today. And number one, top officials in the administration were aware and had conversations before January 6th about the potential for violence that day, and that the far-right groups, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, were mentioned in the White House ahead of the insurrection.
I went back up to our office, and I found Mr. Meadows in his office on the couch. He was scrolling through his phone. I remember leaning against the doorway and saying, I just had an interesting conversation with Rudy, Mark. Sounds like we're going to go to the Capitol. He didn't look up from his phone and said something to the effect of, there's a lot going on, Cass, but I don't know. Things might get real bad on January 6th.
Bombshell testimony. Number two, Mr. Trump knew that supporters at the rally were armed with weapons and wearing body armor before his speech on the ellipse. In fact, police identified people carrying AR-15s and pistols at the rally, but Trump didn't care if they were armed. He wanted the magnetometers taken away because he was concerned with the appearance of an empty rally space.
I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. Let the people in. Take the effing mags away.
I don't care if they're armed. Let my people in. Number three, Mark Meadows said Trump did not want to do anything about the Capitol breach. Hutchinson recalling a heated argument in Meadows' office between White House counsel Pat Cipollone and Meadows, saying they needed to talk to the president while rioters, attackers, were right at the Capitol doors.
Mark looked up at him and said, he doesn't want to do anything, Pat. And Pat said something to the effect of, and very clearly had said this to Mark, something to the effect of, Mark, something needs to be done or people are going to die and the blood's going to be on your effing hands.
Number four, both Rudy Giuliani and Mark Meadows asked for presidential pardons. Trump released a statement today saying that he hardly knows Hutchinson and he had heard negative things about her. We should note he has said that exact same thing about other former aides. NBC's is also out to Pat Cipollone, Mark Meadows' attorney, Steve Scalise, and Ted Cruz for comment. So far, no comment. Joining me now, Vitale and Ken Delanian. Let's begin, though, with Hallie, who's on Capitol Hill. Hallie, we just got the statement from Hutchinson's attorney right before we came on the air, and it says in part, while she did not seek out the attention accompanying her testimony today, she believes that it was her duty and responsibility to provide the committee with her truthful and candid observations of the events surrounding January 6th. So how are people reacting to her testimony on Capitol Hill today, and are any Republicans talking about what they heard today?
Look, Tom, I was in the room for the first half of that hearing, the first hour there, and when they finally took a recess, at least one Democratic lawmaker stood and applauded for Cassidy Hutchinson as she left the room. There was among the people who were there, including other lawmakers, Capitol Police who were impacted by January 6th, and of course the committee members themselves. There was a feeling of gratitude that she would come forward at this point and put herself in the spotlight this way. You have to remember who we're talking about here. This is a 25-year-old young woman who was in many of these meetings, privy to many of these conversations. In some cases, the person who top lawmakers on the Republican side were calling themselves. We know, for example, that at one point in the testimony, she talked about how the #1 House Republican, Kevin McCarthy, actually called her to make sure that former President Donald Trump wasn't coming from his rally at the Ellipse to the Capitol, repeatedly imploring her not to let him come there. So she very much was at the center of a lot of these conversations. And look, we know the committee wanted to talk to Mark Meadows. They're not going to be able to get Mark Meadows, at least as it stands right now, but they did get his top aide, and you see why that was good enough today.
She was incredibly poised, 25 years old, so well-spoken, and there was so much to unpack there. So let's talk about the fact that former President Trump and his team, according to her, knew about the violence ahead of the insurrection, including talking about these far-right groups in the White House before January 6th, and the fact that they all knew supporters were armed at the rally, but they didn't do anything to stop it.
Yeah, you got to imagine that the Department of Justice's ears perked up at that mention when she said that maybe she wasn't in conversations directly, but she was hearing the phrases of Oath Keepers and other far-right groups mentioned in these conversations at the White House. She was also able to testify, for example, about conversations that she had with Rudy Giuliani and others who were part of that kind of outside of the White House effort to overturn the election results, potentially be in touch with some of these far-right leaders. Those are conversations that are important to what the committee is doing, but also very important to what the Department of Justice is doing as they move forward in their own investigations. And look, Ken's going to talk to you about how we've seen these two parallel tracks of investigations between the 6th Committee and DOJ sort of intersect at various points. And it's in hearings like this, when you hear testimony like this, that you start to see how that's very possible and very likely.
Yeah, so let's talk about what Mark Meadows did and didn't do. Cassidy Hutchinson said Meadows did not do anything when he heard supporters were armed. He told the White House counsel that the president didn't want to do anything about the protesters, the attackers, and that he asked for a pardon. Now, how damning is that testimony for Meadows? Any chance he will feel compelled now to testify?
That's what some people who used to work in the White House are saying. People like former Congressman and former Managing Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney saying that he thinks that the options for Meadows are either getting indicted or cooperating with the committee. Now, Mulvaney's not part of this investigation, so he's not necessarily our go-to source on this stuff. But when he lays out the parameters like that, those are realistic scenarios that you have to sort of think about here. I do think, though, when it comes to Mark Meadows, I'm out to his attorney, and we'll see what they respond on this. But the allegation that she made that he was among those asking for a pardon in real time, alongside those lawmakers like Scott Perry and Mo Brooks and Andy Biggs, who we've already reported on, as well as Rudy Giuliani, you do start to see this orbit taking shape around the former president of a group of men who knew that what they were doing was at best legally dubious and at worst flat out illegal, and they were doing it anyway and asking for pardons because of it. Certainly that's something that the committee has done a lot of painstaking work to lay out in detail. The fact that a lot of these people were aware of the legal ramifications of what they were doing, and yet they were doing it anyway. Again, this is not a court, but at the same time, there are courts and other legal entities that are watching.
Yeah, so that sets up Ken Delaney. And Hallie, thank you. Ken, who covers justice and national security. We learned the president knew that there was the potential for violence, that his supporters were armed, but he still encouraged them to go down there anyway, down towards the Capitol. Will this influence DOJ at all? Will they decide that that's enough evidence now to bring charges potentially against the former president?
I'm talking to people today, Tom, who say it will influence DOJ in several ways. One, as you mentioned, today's hearing puts Trump much closer to the violence at the Capitol than the previous sessions. So legal experts and former prosecutors told me this afternoon that evidence that Trump knew the rioters were armed and wanted them to go to the Capitol anyway may renew interest in seeking to charge him with inciting a riot, which was seen as a tough charge, and even seditious conspiracy. And that same evidence could bolster a charge that a lot of people have been talking about, conspiracy to obstruct Congress. And we also saw evidence at the end of that hearing of possible witness tampering. So a lot of new stuff there. But just as importantly, Tom, today's testimony painted a picture of almost moral turpitude of a president who is even more unfit for office than his worst critics imagined. And that may factor in as the DOJ contemplates the really difficult issues around prosecuting a former president who is still the de facto leader of the Republican Party. Justice Department officials aren't robots. They're attuned to public opinion. And to put it bluntly, Cassidy Hutchinson's sort of shocking and intimate portrayal of Trump's unstable behavior and his depraved indifference to the violence that was unfolding may make it easier to imagine prosecuting him.
Yeah, and we still have virtual radio silence from House Republicans right now. We did hear this really shocking testimony today about the former president getting in a fight inside the Beast. That's the big vehicle that he travels in, trying to grab the steering wheel away from the Secret Service. Well, the Secret Service told him they were not going to the Capitol. He even allegedly assaulted or started to assault one of the agents. Hutchinson testified that then White House counsel Cipollone told them that he feared that if the president went to the Capitol, he would be obstructing justice. So specifically, the Electoral College vote is involved there, inciting a riot. Talk us through now. This just adds to the weight.
Yeah, so that behavior was just jaw-dropping and beyond the pale of how you expect a president to act. And again, you have to believe that it will have some influence on the people at the top of the Justice Department as they're deciding whether to go forward with a prosecution. And as for Cipollone, his testimony will be crucial to any criminal investigation. If he actually told Trump that he was at risk of being prosecuted for inciting a riot or obstructing Congress, that would be hugely significant information because it would mean that Trump was put on notice of potential criminality, Tom.
Yeah, and this is hearsay evidence, at least for now. But, I think the bottom line, Ken, the question that everybody is asking around the water cooler, and you and I have talked about, should the DOJ prosecute a former president when the country is so divided? And now the stakes even got higher with today's testimony.
Yeah, that is the agonizing question they're facing, Tom. Is it worse for the country if they do prosecute or if they don't prosecute? And I know for a fact they're thinking about it inside the Justice Department, but it's also worth mentioning that we have not seen any evidence yet that they are getting close to putting Donald Trump in the crosshairs in terms of witnesses and subpoenas and that kind of thing, Tom.
Yeah, and it would not be overnight. All right, Ken, thanks very much. Ken Delaney in there. Let's turn now to the fight over abortion access. With the White House laying out new steps it's taking at the agency level now to clear up what it says is the confusion playing out in the states. Just today, a ban is now in effect in Tennessee. And in South Carolina, Planned Parenthood says the state's 6-week ban is beginning, with the state's governor saying even that is not enough.
I look forward to the day that nobody wants an abortion in South Carolina. We won't need exceptions.
All right, legal challenges playing out right now, really across the country. Look at this map. It shows the 8 states where lawsuits are already underway. In Texas today, abortions can resume at some clinics after court blocks a pre-Roe ban in 2, Utah and Louisiana. Courts have also blocked full bans. And today, Health and Human Services Secretary Xavier Becerra is providing a roadmap for what he'll do, saying the stakes really are very high now.
How we respond will speak to how we view the rights, the dignity, and the well-being of women everywhere. This is a moment of crisis in healthcare.
NBC's Kelly O'Donnell is traveling with the president. She's in Madrid right now. Kelly, the HHS secretary, laying out several steps he wants to take, including ensuring patient privacy and increasing access to medication abortion. Walk us through these steps, if you don't mind.
Good to be with you, Tom. So if you look at an agency like Health and Human Services that has been so dominated by COVID and vaccines and now has what the secretary calls a new crisis to deal with. And so with the federal government looking for ways to try to protect access to reproductive services and trying to protect the privacy of patients so that they would be able to have their medical relationship with a doctor remain private, to have the care that they're seeking not be exposed to any kind kind of extra scrutiny. Also things like the medication that can result in abortion, making certain there's enough supply and that that's available. They're looking for those federal tools they can use to make that accessible, as states are looking at a whole range of legal challenges and a patchwork of what the law will be around the country, making it more confusing for many people if they're not sure how things will play out in their own state. So here's what the federal government can't do. It can't just set new boundaries on what can happen that will cover the nation. That's what the Supreme Court overturned. So it's a piecemeal approach, but one where the federal government, through the Department of Health and Human Services, says they will look for ways to use the opportunities they have. So they can try to deal with the FDA on medications. They can do things about transportation to make sure if women go from a state where it is not legal any longer to a state where abortion services would be provided, that they can have that transportation be uninterrupted. It's an array of things that will at times be confusing, that might raise a lot of new questions, but those are the sort of levers that are available to the federal government, and it'll take a lot of education on the part of public health officials. Tom?
Okay, but at the end of the day, these are all things subject to federal agencies, right? So if an anti-abortion, pro-life president takes office, he or she could reverse these policies. There's no permanent protection being proposed here like the kinds Democrats are calling for.
That's right. And by the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it goes back to the states. And if there were in the next election or a subsequent election, a president that was not willing to support these plans and these ideas and policies, it could change again. That's what is so different about a period post Roe v. Wade, because it is not a uniform policy around the country. And that's how states will reflect what is in the nature of their own citizenry. And in some places, as you saw with the governor of South Carolina, there are people supportive of this decision. Yeah. And in many other places, and public polling suggests, there are a lot of Americans who did not want to see this overturned. Tom?
Of course, absolutely. A third to 40% of the country supports the Supreme Court, depending on the poll. Before you go quickly, we're hearing from the Pentagon about abortion protections as well.
Well, again, that would be federal employees through the military. And so the memo from the Pentagon tells us that those services would be provided where legal, and that there would be financial support for members of the military who might need to travel to another state to seek reproductive services as well. It's not a case where those services can be paid for and provided on federal land by the Pentagon or military installations. But where it's already legal, they will continue that, and they'll try to support members in uniform. Tom?
Kelly, thank you. Kelly O'Donnell, who's in Madrid with the president. Today, President Biden is calling what's turning out to be the deadliest smuggling case in modern U.S. history. Quote, horrifying and heartbreaking. 51 people found dead in an abandoned 18-wheeler in San Antonio. In a statement, the president adds that his administration will do everything possible to stop human smugglers and traffickers. More than a dozen people, including kids, survived and are now in the hospital. The San Antonio police chief says 3 people are in custody, but they're not totally sure if they are connected to this incident. And it's also quickly becoming political. Texas Governor Abbott tweeting that these deaths are on Biden and his open border policies. NBC News correspondent Morgan Chesky is on the scene for us.
Yeah, we are standing on the edge of what's become a massive crime scene on a remote road on the outskirts of San Antonio, and it was just about 100 yards behind me. That's where that tractor trailer was located that a worker heard cries for help coming from inside late yesterday, and upon opening the door, witnessed the absolutely unthinkable. Dozens upon dozens of migrant men, women, and children barely alive, in some cases already perished as a result of the excruciating triple-digit temperatures here in this part of Texas. Meantime, federal authorities say they have 3 individuals in custody, but as of right now, they are not tying them directly to this smuggling plot. In the meantime, we know 16 survivors were pulled from this tractor trailer. They are in San Antonio area hospitals. 4 of those individuals are pediatric patients, young children that were inside that trailer for hours and hours on end. We have seen canine units brought here to the scene today, scouring the surrounding area just to make sure that absolutely everyone has been accounted for because of the danger that this heat presents and also just the tragic scene that was witnessed yesterday with so many of those people packed inside that tractor trailer, which has now been taken by federal authorities to be further scoured for evidence. We'll send it back to you.
All right, Morgan, thanks very much. Morgan Chesky on the ground. Jeffrey Epstein's former confidant and convicted sex trafficker, Elaine Maxwell, sentenced today, 20 years in prison. Maxwell was convicted back in December, you may recall, 5 federal charges for recruiting and grooming teenage girls to be sexually abused by Epstein. After the sentencing, we heard from one survivor, Annie Farmer, who says she hopes Maxwell's sentence shows it's never too late for accountability. Here's what she said.
If you're someone who's experienced sexual abuse or exploitation and did not feel safe to report those crimes, or were not believed when you did, or were told that the perpetrators would not be held accountable, this is for you.
Maxwell herself addressed the court today also, telling survivors, quote, "I am sorry for the pain you have experienced," and that she hopes her conviction brings some closure. Tom Winter joins me now from New York. Tom, talk us through the details of the sentencing and the considerations for what this judge went through when it came to deciding how much time to give her.
Right. So initially, Tom, prosecutors had asked for 30 to 55 years, which for the 60-year-old former socialite would have essentially meant a life sentence, of course. During the course of the proceedings, before we heard from some of those victims and before we heard from Maxwell herself, as you said, there was a bit of a discussion as far as the range that the judge can impose. Now, the judge is allowed to go outside of what is the recommended sentencing range and the guidelines, if you will. And so those were revised down to the maximum being about just a little over 19 and a half years. She went above that. She went with 20 years in jail for Maxwell, which means she'll get out just a little bit before her 80th birthday when you consider good time, assuming that's what happens here. So, yes, 20 years in jail, additional 5 years of supervised release, and the judge hitting her with the maximum fine of $750,000. So that's what Maxwell has to contend with from here. That's the sentence that was imposed, and a pretty stiff one when you consider that for the majority of the rest of her life, she's going to be behind bars, Tom.
Yeah, a remarkable fall for a socialite. I mean, we should remember and remind the audience that her father was a very wealthy British figure. But let's talk also about what the other survivors said today in court when the judge gave them the opportunity to speak ahead of the sentencing. What did they say?
Well, a whole host of statements. They were very emotional. All of them broke down in some capacity. As you can imagine, today was a day that they've waited for a very long time. In some cases, 20, even more than that, 25 plus years to have this moment of justice. That's what they said. A couple of common themes: the tremendous psychological damage and abuse that these women suffered over the last couple of years. On top of that, Tom, the damage from a substance and alcohol standpoint, the abuse that they've had as a result of that, as a result of what they say was the treatment by Maxwell and Epstein. We also heard in particular from a statement, and I want to read it to you, a statement from Virginia Giuffre. She's, of course, been closely linked to activities involving Prince Andrew, sexual activities involving her that he's steadfastly denied over the years. But she said, in a statement read by her lawyer, "You deserve to spend the rest of your life in a jail cell. You deserve to be trapped in a cage forever, just like you trapped your victims." And that was kind of the common refrain that we heard, Tom.
Yeah, imagine if it was your daughter. Listen, also her attorney, Maxwell's attorney, trying to get less time for her, making the case that she's been a positive influence on other inmates. Do they have any other legal options here moving forward?
Sure, they do, and they've already indicated that they are going to seek grounds for appeal. And interestingly, the judge that oversaw this case will actually be headed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, will likely have to be recused from that. But yes, they've already said that they're going to seek a route of appeal. They've got a couple of different questions and complaints as it pertains to some of the facts in this case and the way that the law was charged. So that's what we should expect them to see going forward. Maxwell herself not admitting any wrongdoing, just talking about how she felt for the victims today in court, Tom.
Yeah, I was struck by that. She did not admit to wrongdoing in her statement. Tom, thanks. Tom Winter there in New York City.
That's right.
Breaking news right now. An FDA advisory panel just voting in favor of updating COVID vaccines to help deal with newer strains of the virus. The FDA's vaccine chief says earlier on in the discussion, reformulated vaccines are needed because immunity for people who have received both doses of the COVID vaccine and even people who got a booster, that immunity is going to start dropping by the fall.
Waning immunity combined with the potential emergence of novel variants during a time this winter when we will move inside as a population increases our risk of a major COVID-19 outbreak.
Drug companies Moderna and Pfizer have already been testing updated versions of their vaccines to deal with the BA.1 Omicron variant that led to a massive surge in infections over the winter. Both companies have said their respective redesigned shots create a better immune response against BA.1 than other current vaccine doses. Dr. Kavita Patel joins me now. Nice to see you, as always, Doctor. Can you talk us about this decision the panel made? What happens now? What's the timeline for when these new shots would actually be available?
Yeah, Tom, that was probably the most important data point that I was listening for. And all three manufacturers, Pfizer, Moderna, and Novavax, said that an updated vaccine, pending FDA authorization, could be available October or later. So, one, we're looking at kind of having a long period of time with no updated booster or updated vaccine. And number two, that gives the agency time now to think about which version. Is it the version that's tailored for BA.1, the one that's tailored for BA.4 or 5? How will they talk to the manufacturers about releasing this vaccine? What quantities? All the details have to kind of get ironed out between now and whenever we have some of that data in the fall. But it kind of ends that question, Tom, of do we need another shot? It seems almost unanimously the answer was yes.
Well, as you know, I've called you on the phone many times with a COVID question and a vaccine question from my own family. Let me ask you this. The testing that Moderna and Pfizer are doing right now is based off the original Omicron variant, right, which has already been replaced by more contagious versions of the virus. So do we not know right now which one of these will actually spread by the winter or the fall? Do we have any clues yet? And how do we get ahead of that surge when it actually comes to reformulating this vaccine?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tom. The question of what will we be facing in the fall, that was actually something the FDA panel took on directly and said, look, we know that we can't predict what could happen come fall, and that if we over-tailor the vaccine for a specific variant and don't try to do something broader, then we could be in trouble because BA.4 and 5 could come and go, and there could be another variant. We don't know what it would be. And I think that's why there was a real enthusiasm by the panel to have what would be called a bivalent, or having at least a part of the vaccine that deals with Omicron, and then, Tom, a part of the vaccine that can deal with the original strains, or at least having that broad immunity from the original strain. So bottom line, we have to expect the fall would have some activity, and we just don't know what it'll look like.
Okay, and we did hear from experts about the, quote, substantial possibility of resurgences. Based on the data right now, what do we think about in the coming weeks and the months? What do we look for, and what will this new virus look like? Or do we just not know yet?
We don't know enough to say with certainty, but what we do know is that the rates of BA.4 and 5 have picked up significantly in the country. The CDC released data today as well that shows about 40% of what we're measuring is BA.4 and 5. Tom, expect that to ride a wave over the next 3 to 5 weeks, and then it'll come down. And then, as usual, almost in a clock fashion, weeks after that, we might pick up another wave. Will it be BA.4 and 5 or a new one? We'll have to stay tuned.
Oh, boy, we just can't get rid of this thing. That is the biggest peacock I've ever seen behind you, by the way. Thank you. We appreciate your time, Dr. Patel. All right, today more than 2,000 flights have been delayed, more than 600 canceled in the U.S. ahead of the July 4th weekend. That according to FlightAware tracking data. Airlines continue to face pilot shortages and scheduling conflicts. Why? The FAA says airlines haven't properly staffed in the wake of the pandemic, but the airlines tell me the FAA doesn't have the air traffic controllers to maintain what is happening in the skies. NBC nightly news anchor Lester Holt spoke with the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, in an interview this afternoon exclusively about what we might be seeing lying ahead for holiday travelers.
Is the July 4th holiday a recipe for disaster, given the issues with the system right now?
Well, what I'll say is that there are going to be challenges, but we're watching it closely.
One airliner insider today said it's blue sky cancellations today, no explanation. Lester Holt's exclusive interview with Secretary Pete tonight, 6:30 p.m. Eastern on NBC Nightly News. Coming up, voters head to the polls for the first time since the blockbuster Supreme Court abortion ruling. How the overturning of Roe v. Wade is playing a role in primary races today. Plus, if you're thinking about renting an Airbnb, there's a major new rule you need to hear about. What you can't do. We're talking about that and more after the break. It's a Tuesday, so of course voters are casting ballots in their first primary since the Supreme Court's decision which overturned Roe v. Wade. In Colorado, the abortion issue is splitting the Republican candidates for both senator and governor. In both races, there's one Republican candidate who believes in exceptions to abortion, like in the cases of rape and incest, and to save the life of the mother. And they're up against an opponent who opposes abortion altogether. The winner of the Senate primary will face incumbent Democratic Senator Michael Bennet in November, while the winner in the gubernatorial primary will take on Democratic Governor Jared Polis. And believe it or not, among the fundraisers for the far-right Republicans right now, Democratic groups, they're dumping money into ads for these candidates on the far right, hoping that they'll win the Republican nomination and be easier to beat in November. So joining us now from my hometown, Denver, NBC's Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, it looks like you're at Larimer Square right now, I'm guessing, or near the 16th Street Mall, downtown Denver. You've been talking, am I right? You've been talking primary with voters out there just days after the Roe versus Wade decision was overturned. What are you hearing from people there on the streets?
Tom, everybody at NBC knows that you are Mr. Colorado, and so therefore we had to come here on primary day. Those 6 other states are having their primaries as well. And the big question, Tom, is whether you're coming in for the Avalanche Parade tomorrow, but we can get to that later on tonight. Hey, look, on primary day, there is actually a major storyline that is playing out here, and you laid it out there. You know, Colorado has trended blue over the last several election cycles. At the same time, Democrats acknowledge to us that there's the real chance that this could be competitive here, not only the Senate race, but also the governor's race, the Secretary of State's race. And when you're looking at these Republican primaries here today, you are looking at these election-denying candidates being in the fray, people who believe that Donald Trump and contend that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. But then there's also another Republican candidate in both the Senate race and the governor's race who maintain that they're more of the moderate type figures in this race. Even the Senate candidate, John O'Day, I talked to him, and he is supportive of even codifying some abortion, reproductive rights into law. He said he would vote for it if he went to Congress. That's the type of candidate we're talking about. Yet, which candidate have the Democrats and Democratic aligned forces infused cash money behind? It's those election-denying ones because they believe that they would have a better chance the general election. Of course, though, it's risky. And frankly here, Tom, there's not very good polling. So there's a lot of question marks heading into tonight on which of these candidates in these Republican primaries will come out on top.
Yeah, and so while the Denver-Boulder metro area is pretty blue, Colorado Springs is pretty red, so is the Western Slope, so is the Eastern Plains. What happens? What happens if these Democratic groups are successful in boosting that right-wing Republican, and then actually that right-wing Republican wins? Have the Democrats considered the chances that this may actually go the wrong way for them?
And, you know, actually, and that's where I was talking with the top, the Republican running for governor, who is the one who contends that there is no mass voter fraud that would have changed the 2020 election. And I asked her about this Democratic confusion to try to get her from being the candidate not on this. And she said she found it quite hypocritical. You know, on one hand, Democrats are contending that these election-denying candidates are dangerous to the democracy, yet at the same time, they're breathing life into them and giving them a chance. That Senate candidate in this, Ron Hanks is his name. He's a state lawmaker. He's publicly has only raised about $30,000+, and yet Democratic aligned forces have put in more than $1 million to promote his campaign and his candidacy here. And so that really, I think, is something that the Democrats haven't quite reckoned with and ultimately will not until the general election rolls around, and whether some of those election-denying candidates could pull off upsets in places like here in Colorado, but also the likes of Illinois, Tom.
All right. You spent enough time there. I think you're an honorary Coloradan. I'm going to get a W honorary Coloradan right now. Thanks, Vaughn. Vaughn Hilliard on the streets, downtown Denver. Let's get you over to the 5 things that our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, a federal report shows school shootings rose to the highest number in 2 decades. The National Center for Education Statistics released a 31-page report. It found there were at least 93 incidents at public and private schools across the U.S. over the past 2 years. A spokesperson for the center says the data helps officials and policymakers take preventive measures. Number 2, another study found weed users are 25% more likely to need emergency care in hospital. The study found marijuana smokers had higher blood and urine levels of several smoke-related toxins, also showing that physical bodily injury was the leading cause of emergency visits, followed by respiratory reasons as a close second. Number 3, Airbnb users, listen up. Airbnb has officially announced its global ban on parties. The company placed a temporary restriction 2 years ago after 5 people were killed in a shooting back in 2019 at one of its listings. Anyone who attempts to violate the no parties policy could be suspended from the account or removed fully from the Airbnb platform. Number 4, Serena Williams back at Wimbledon for the first time since her injury last year. And in just the last few minutes, she's lost to France's Harmony Tan. Serena was looking for her 8th Wimbledon title. Number 5, Elmo just got his COVID vaccine. In a public service announcement by Sesame Workshop, Elmo and his dad talked about the safety of the vaccine for kids under the age of 5. Elmo is still 3.5 years old. Still ahead, more on that deadly train derailment in Missouri we reported on last night. The NTSB is on the scene. We're going to have an update on the investigation when we come back. Coming up on News Now, Cleveland Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson's future is on the line. He's facing a 1-year suspension from the league for sexual misconduct allegations. We're going to have more on that coming up. But first, now to Missouri, where we're learning of another death in the Amtrak train derailment, bringing the overall number of dead now to 4. And in just the last couple of minutes, we're hearing from the chair of the NTSB, who's on the scene. She says she's frustrated the agency's warnings about passive grade crossings. In other words, no warnings coming across the warning. None of those have been followed yet.
Anytime our recommendations aren't heeded, of course, I'm upset because we see tragedy after tragedy after tragedy and numerous fatalities and injuries. And we know, and it's very frustrating for our investigators, very frustrating when they are on scene and they know what would have prevented this.
This new drone footage we're getting from the scene, actually, as the cleanup efforts begin. Amtrak's now saying about 275 passengers and 12 crew members were on board at the time, more than we thought yesterday. Police say about 150 went to area hospitals with varying injuries. And these videos from inside show you just how terrifying that scene was. We still don't know the names of the victims, but we know that 3 were inside the train and 1 was in the truck that was hit. Maggie Vespa is in Mendon, Missouri for us. Maggie, the NTSB chair, really laid out her frustration here with these passive grade crossings. And again, that's the idea that there is nothing to stop a car from going across in front of the trucks. Walk us through that.
Exactly, Tom, and I should note we have a siren approaching, not related to this story. We've been hearing it called an uncontrolled crossing in this context, and basically we're told what that means, and we heard this from NTSB and we heard it from local officials, is it's exactly what you said, a crossing with nothing stopping a driver going across the railroad tracks, whether a train is coming or not. There's no arm that comes down, there's no bell or anything like that that alerts them that a train is nearby. There's no flashing lights. This one in particular just had kind of the X railroad crossing signs and then a stop sign as well. And we've heard from officials, you just heard NTSB, and we've heard from local people saying to them it just seems clearly like a really dangerous setup. And now that is indeed a key point that they're looking into. Tom.
I think I read a stat a short time ago that said there are about 3,300 of these types of crossings, if you will, that are not marked. And it can be very dangerous, right? Or half-arm. Walk us through that number there.
Well, that is something that they're looking into right now. At least that is one of the stats that we have heard today. But at this point, the NTSB says they're still investigating, and they're still advocating for a lot of these to be improved and have the safety upgrades implemented that a lot of people are advocating for. And on a state level, we've actually found documentation that shows the state of Missouri had flagged this very crossing for what they called safety improvements, allocating up to $400,000, according to the records that we found, to upgrade this over the next few years. Obviously, we didn't get to that point, but the NTSB being very clear, you're right, this is a problem, they say, in a number of communities across the country. And in fact, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg confirming that to Lester Holt just a few hours ago today.
Yeah, and I guess we're still waiting on confirmation about how fast the train was moving at the time, whether it blew the horn, and yet, listen, you can't stop a train traveling at 80, 90, 100 miles an hour.
Exactly. The initial estimate that we got was up to 79 miles per hour. Experts saying it would take the train up to a mile to stop. Were that the case, as far as the horn is concerned, NTSB says that's one of many things that they'll get details on with that events recorder that they want to get their hands on, which very possibly could have recorded video of the moments leading up to this crash. So again, they're looking into this, but gave this presser just to give briefings on what they know at this point, Tom.
Maggie, thank you. Maggie Vespa, who's on the scene for us. We look forward to seeing more of your reporting on NBC Nightly News tonight. Coming up, the morning after pill is flying off the shelves after Roe v. Wade was overturned. How women are stockpiling contraception as some major pharmacies now begin to limit them. Plus, New York City just started administering the monkeypox vaccine, but NYC has already had to pause the program. We'll tell you why in tonight's Local. NBC News covers hundreds of stories each day, and because you couldn't possibly read, watch, or listen to all of them, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us they're watching and what's going down in their regions right now. In a segment we call The Local, from our Southeast Bureau, the grandmother of the shooter at Robb Elementary. That in Uvalde, Texas. She was released from the hospital today. Celia Sally Gonzalez was shot in the face at her house by her grandson before he left and then opened fire at the elementary school. The 10-year-old victim, still at the hospital, has now been upgraded to good condition. From our Northeast Bureau, New York City and D.C. quickly ran out of the monkeypox vaccine supply just hours after opening up appointments. D.C. Health said on Twitter there will be an update tomorrow on additional appointment availability. New York City Mayor Adams said this morning as soon as they get more vaccines, they'll give them out. No timeline, though, on when that might be. And from our West Coast Bureau, the University of Arizona is offering Native American undergraduate students free tuition through a new grant at the campus in Tucson. Beginning this fall, full-time undergrads who are from the state's 22 federally recognized Native American tribes will qualify for the Arizona Native Scholars Grant. The program was funded by reallocating financial aid dollars. And as they say in Tucson, bear down. All right, the morning after contraception pill has become a sought-after purchase for many who are concerned now about access to reproductive health care. Some folks even stockpiling the medication in anticipation of possible contraception disruptions and restrictions. It's led a few pharmacies to start limiting the number of emergency contraceptive pills that customers can purchase. The increase in demand follows the Supreme Court's decision, of course, to overturn Roe v. Wade. Surveys show that roughly a quarter of American women have used emergency contraception pills to prevent unintended pregnancy at some point in their lives. NBC News medical correspondent Dr. Natalie Azar joins us now with the latest. Dr. Azar, can we start off with just explaining now what's the morning after pill and how is it different from an abortion pill?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. So I think the fundamental difference here is that the morning after pill is meant to prevent pregnancy. The medication abortion is used to safely and effectively end a pregnancy that has already been established. Coincidentally, they both involve use of a hormone called progesterone. In the case of the morning after pill, it's a man-made form of progesterone, which is naturally made by the ovary. Giving it is thought to prevent ovulation. There's probably also some impact on inhibiting or preventing fertilization and implantation. So again, can prevent a pregnancy. And this is meant, the most common one that people have heard of is Plan B. That is taken within 72 hours of either, failed contraception, condom breaking, that kind of thing, or unprotected intercourse.
Okay, and so now some pharmacies are limiting the number of emergency contraceptives that somebody can buy to avoid shortages. Is it relatively easy to find and buy emergency contraception on store shelves right now, or is it getting tougher?
Right. So we have a statement, I think earlier, even just today, this is how quickly the news changes, Tom, that certain drug chains were going to be, drugstore chains, I should say, were going to be limiting the number of emergency contraception that each customer could purchase, up to 3 per person. Yeah. We do have a statement now from both CVS and from Walgreens that while CVS did initially experience a shortage, they do have enough now. They say they have an ample supply of emergency contraceptives. Walgreens says the same thing. There's no limit to the number that they are allowing patrons to purchase. They have ample supply, Tom.
All right. Now, Instagram and Facebook, they've been banning posts that are offering abortion pills following the end of Roe v. Wade. Do you think that the reaction by social media companies could impact outcomes for women seeking help? And what should one do if they need access to an abortion pill right now?
So this is the big challenge right now, Tom. If you are a woman who lives in a state where abortion is illegal, it includes medication abortion. There are a lot of different grassroots efforts that are underway. For example, mobile clinics that are being set up in states where abortion is legal, right on the border of states where abortion is illegal, so that women can cross the border and obtain a prescription for a medication abortion. In addition, there is this telecommunications, or I should say telehealth service. It's called Aid Access. And this is a Dutch company that essentially can and will provide medication abortion prescriptions to women in every state in the country. These are European doctors who can provide online consultations. They will, as I said, mail these pills to women anywhere in the U.S. There's very little legal risk to European providers as opposed to providers here in the U.S. Tom.
All right. Dr. Azar, thank you. Natalie, always nice to hear your thoughts. Thanks very much. Coming up, NFL quarterback Deshaun Watson facing a disciplinary hearing from his league for his actions off the field. The suspension he could get after several sexual misconduct allegations. Back now, when a closely watched hearing got underway today for Cleveland Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson to determine whether he violated the NFL's personal conduct policy. Watson settled 20 of 24 civil lawsuits that accused him of sexual misconduct. Just yesterday, a woman who'd already sued him filed another suit against the Houston Texans. That's his former team. She alleges they gave him resources to enable him and, quote, turned a blind eye to his behavior. According to the Wall Street Journal, the NFL has been pushing for his indefinite suspension. Watson has been denying any wrongdoing and vowed to clear his name. He says he's never assaulted any of the women or forced them to non-consensual sex acts. The NFL declined to comment, and Watson's legal team did not reply to NBC's request for comments. NBC's Jesse Kirsch is following this. Here's what I think most people don't get. He's been accused by 24 women of sexual misconduct or inappropriate behavior, and yet he settled, right? So one would presume you don't settle unless you have some culpability.
Well, Tom, here's something interesting that has come to light. And by the way, I want to point out we have now heard from Watson's legal team. They say they are not going to comment further until this hearing is over with. So they are giving us that much information, but pretty much tight lips all around on this today. We have not heard back from the NFL Players Association, which is involved as well. And Tom, an interesting thing in the collective bargaining agreement, which is between the league and its players, which the league pointed me to earlier, if you look at how this all plays out, the league has to announce its proposal for punishment and share that with the Players Association and with the player who is under scrutiny at least 10 days before the hearing. So if you backtrack where we are today with this hearing starting now, 10 days ago was right before those settlements were announced with 20 of the 24 accusers. So that gives you an idea of some of the insight that Watson's legal team would have had in recent days when they went forward with those settlements.
All right, so how does this process now work? It's not a court of law. It's the NFL commissioner involved, we think, right?
Yes, absolutely. So there is a person who's been appointed. It is a former federal judge who is the arbitrator, if you will, in this situation. And so they are presenting evidence. They are presenting their arguments. We know that the NFL, before this hearing, would have had to present what it proposes as the punishment. The punishment that is announced by this independent person will be the final punishment. However, there is a but, and that would be that either side could appeal. And if this is appealed, it then goes to Commissioner Roger Goodell, and he would have the final say. So the buck truly does stop with the commissioner, and his word would be the final one. And again, according to the Wall Street Journal, citing multiple people who are familiar with the matter, the NFL is pushing for an indefinite suspension of at least a year. The NFL, when we reached out for comment on that, Tom, would not give us any clarity on if that is in fact true.
All right, and let's just remind the audience that the Browns gave him a 5-year, $230 million guaranteed contract back in March, right? He may appeal, but regardless, that's a lot of dough for somebody who's already settled 20-some-odd lawsuits for sexual misconduct.
Yeah, it is a record-breaking contract, and that just adds to what has been such a fascinating story that sports fans are scratching their heads at. So he has all this money at stake, obviously, reputation. 2 grand juries declined to indict him. So criminally, he does not seem to have any immediate culpability, any immediate risk there. He's obviously settling 20 of 24 lawsuits. 4 of them, though, are moving forward. You mentioned there's another lawsuit in the mix now as well. But don't forget, Tom, we're just a couple weeks away from NFL training camp starting up for the Browns. So anyone's guess what's going to be happening in the days ahead.
His reputation is clearly on the line and his paycheck. All right, Jesse, thank you very much. Jesse Kirsch. That's a wrap for this hour. We're going to have much more tomorrow. Same time, same place. And the coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.